All right, ready to dive into some seriously deep philosophical waters. Today we're going way back to the 13th century to explore the work of Godfrey of Fontaines, a thinker who wasn't afraid to challenge some of the biggest names in philosophy, even guys like Aquinas.
Yeah, Godfrey's really fascinating. He didn't just critique other philosophers, he had this really systematic way of looking at things, especially when it comes to the interplay of what he called act and potency.
Okay, so let's break down this act and potency thing because it seems like it was kind of a big deal for him.
It was huge for him. It was like the lens through which he viewed everything. Basically, think of potency as the potential for something to exist and act as its actual existence. So like a seed has the potency to become a tree, but it doesn't reach its full act, its full being, until it actually grows into one. And Godfrey applied this to, like, everything.
So how does this whole act and potency thing play out when Godfrey tackles big philosophical questions like, what is the nature of being?
Well, that's where we get into metaphysics, the study of being itself. Like, what does it mean for something to exist at all? And how can we distinguish between different modes of existence?
Right, right. And I remember from my philosophy classes that there was this big debate about essence and existence. Did Godfrey weigh in on that?
Oh, absolutely. He was right in the middle of it, going back and forth with big names like Aquinas and Henry of Ghent.
What were the different positions? It's been a while since I've looked at my metaphysics notes.
Well, Aquinas argued that for created things, things other than God, there's a real distinction between essence and existence. Like, essence is what a thing is, its whatness, and existence is the act of being. They can't exist apart from each other, but they are distinct.
So like if we use that classic apple example, an apple's essence is its appleness, but its existence is the fact that it's like an actual apple out there in the world. Right?
Exactly. Now, Henry of Ghent, he had a different take. He rejected this real distinction between essence and existence and said they were intentionally distinct, which was kind of a middle ground.
So where did Godfrey land in all of this? Was he Team Aquinas or Team Henry?
Neither, actually. He had his own unique take. He argued that essence and existence are identical. Like, whatever's true of a thing's essence is also true of its existence.
So no separation between what a thing is and that it is.
Right. And this is where his whole act and potency framework comes in. He used it to explain how something could exist potentially, even when it doesn't actually exist.
Can you give an example of that? It sounds a little tricky.
Sure, let's say you're thinking about a unicorn. Obviously, unicorns don't exist, right? At least not in the real world. But for Godfrey, it exists potentially in your mind because you have the concept of a unicorn. It has essence, unicornness, but not actual existence.
I see. So the idea of a unicorn has the potential to exist, but it's not actually out there galloping around.
Exactly. And this idea applies to all sorts of things, not just mythical creatures. Godfrey used this framework to analyze pretty much everything, like simple objects to the most complex philosophical concepts.
Okay, so this is starting to make a little more sense, but how does all of this apply to God? Like, does God have both essence and existence?
That is a great question, and one that Godfrey definitely grappled with. He was drawing on this idea from Proclus that what participates in the one is both one and not one. So even God, who is pure actuality, can be understood through this lens of act and potency, but in a unique way.
So even in God, there's this interplay of act and potency.
Yes, but it's not a division or separation within God. It's more about our limited human way of trying to understand God's infinite nature.
Okay, I think I'm following.
So God's essence is like his whatness, what he is in himself, and his existence is his isness, the fact that he is. But for Godfrey, these two are ultimately identical in God.
That's a pretty mind-bending concept. So are you saying that even God, who is pure actuality, can be understood through this framework of act and potency? It's like he's trying to find a way to talk about God's infinite nature using these philosophical concepts that we can at least try to grasp.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes Godfrey so challenging and rewarding to read. He really wrestled with some of the most fundamental questions about being, existence, and the nature of God in a way that is both rigorous and insightful.
Yeah, this is already giving me a lot to think about. And we haven't even touched on how we can even know God with our limited human understanding, which I'm guessing act and potency plays a role in as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's where things get even more interesting. And that's where Godfrey really distinguishes himself from thinkers like Aquinas. But I think we need to save that for the next part.
Right. We've covered a lot of ground already. Let's take a moment to let all of this sink in, and then we'll come back and explore how Godfrey tackled this challenge of knowing God. Okay, so we've talked about how Godfrey of Fontaines was really into the nature of being itself. And he used this framework of act and potency to explain how things exist and how they change. But where does God fit into all of this? How did Godfrey approach the idea of knowing God?
Well, this is where Godfrey really starts to challenge some of the big philosophical and theological ideas of his time. He was really engaged in these debates about the eternity of the world, the nature of God's attributes, and how our little finite human minds can even begin to understand something infinite.
So let's start with that eternity of the world thing.
Yeah.
Was Godfrey on board with the idea that the world had always existed?
That was a really hot topic back in the 13th century. You had thinkers like Bonaventure who were like, absolutely not. The world had a beginning. God created it at a specific point in time, and they thought you could actually prove that philosophically.
Okay, so Keen World had a beginning. What about the other side?
Then you had folks like Aquinas, who famously said that, we know through faith that the world began, but reason alone can't prove it. He even said that an eternally created world was possible.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement for a theologian.
Yeah.
So where did Godfrey land on this whole debate? Was he with Bonaventure or Aquinas?
He was actually pretty heavily influenced by Aquinas on this one. He agreed that, logically speaking, there's no contradiction in saying that something was created but has always existed.
Wait, so how does that work? How can something be both created AD eternal?
Well, for Godfrey, it all boils down to understanding the nature of God's power, right? He was basically saying that God could, if he wanted to, create something from eternity. It's a tough concept to wrap your head around, but it gets to the core of how Godfrey saw the relationship between God and creation.
Yeah, I can imagine that there were some objections to this whole eternally created world idea. I mean, it seems kind of counterintuitive to think of something as being both created and eternal at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest pushbacks was this idea that an eternal world would mean that there's an actual infinity of things, like an infinite number of souls, which was a big problem philosophically. It brought up all these questions about the nature of infinity and if it could actually exist in reality.
Yeah, an infinite number of anything is hard to imagine. So how did Godfrey deal with this?
Well, he really wrestled with it and looked at a bunch of different possibilities. Aquinas, in his work De Aeternitate Mundi, argued that it hadn't been proven that God couldn't create an actual infinity. But Godfrey seemed to be leaning toward the idea that an actual infinity, whether it was physical things or spiritual things, was impossible.
So if an actual infinity is impossible, how do you square that with this idea of an eternally created world?
It's a tough one, and Godfrey explored a few different options. One idea he considered, although he didn't fully endorse it, was this concept of the transmigration of souls.
Transmigration,
Yeah.
like souls moving from one body to another.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea was that there's a fixed number of souls, but they keep getting reborn into new bodies over an infinite amount of time.
So not an infinite number of souls, just souls getting recycled through time. It's an interesting idea, but does it actually solve the problem?
Well, Godfrey himself admitted that it didn't really line up with the Christian view of the world being created for humans to achieve eternal happiness. The idea of souls bouncing around from body to body forever doesn't really fit with the concept of heaven and hell.
Right, right. So where did Godfrey end up on the whole eternity question? Did he come down firmly on one side or the other?
Basically, he called it a draw. He argued that you can't definitively prove or disprove the possibility of an eternal world. So it was a question that he left open, which is, kind of classic Godfrey, always willing to explore different possibilities and admit that there are limits to what we can know through reason alone.
Always keeping things interesting. Okay, so we've explored Godfrey's views on the eternity of the world. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about his ideas about God's attributes. How did he approach this topic, especially given his commitment to the concept of divine simplicity?
This is where Godfrey's thinking gets really subtle and complex. He was working within this tradition that emphasized God's absolute simplicity, right? So the idea is that God isn't made up of parts. He's not divisible in any way. But this raises a big question. How can we talk about God having all these different attributes like goodness, wisdom, power, if he's absolutely simple?
That's a great point. It does seem like you run into a contradiction if you say that God is simple but also has all these distinct attributes.
Right, and that's where Godfrey's philosophical skills come in. He argued that we can conceptually distinguish between God's attributes, but that this distinction doesn't actually exist in God himself. It's just a result of our limited human way of understanding things.
So it's like we might say God is good and God is wise, as if they are two separate qualities, but in reality, they're just different ways of talking about the same divine reality.
Exactly. God's goodness isn't separate from his wisdom or his power. They're all one and the same in God. But because our minds can't grasp the fullness of God's simple being, we have to distinguish them conceptually.
This is reminding me of that whole essence and existence thing we were talking about earlier. It's like Godfrey is saying those are conceptually distinct, but ultimately identical in God. Is he kind of doing the same thing with God's attributes?
You got it. That's a key theme running through all of Godfrey's work. He's constantly trying to bridge this gap between our limited human understanding and the infinite reality of God. He recognizes that we need to use concepts and distinctions to talk about God, but he's insistent that those distinctions don't actually exist in God himself.
Yeah, it's a subtle point, but it's really profound when you think about it. So how does Godfrey think we can come to know God's attributes if we can't fully grasp them with our little human minds?
Well, he argues that we come to know God's attributes through their effects in creation. So we see goodness and wisdom and power reflected in the world around us, and then we ascribe these perfections to God, but infinitely.
So we're using our experience of the world to try and understand God, but always acknowledging that our understanding will always be limited.
Exactly. That's a key insight. For Godfrey, our knowledge of God in this life will always be imperfect, but it's still real knowledge. And it's based on our understanding of being, which brings us right back to metaphysics.
It seems like everything circles back to metaphysics for Godfrey. He's always trying to understand the most fundamental nature of reality and how it relates to God.
Absolutely. And that actually leads us to another really fascinating aspect of Godfrey's thought, which is his ideas about how things change and interact with each other in the world. Specifically, his views on substance and accidents.
Now this is where things start to get really intricate, right? We're talking about the very building blocks of reality. I'm ready. Let's unpack Godfrey's thoughts on substance and accidents. Okay, so we've taken this incredible journey through Godfrey of Fontaine's ideas about being, existence, the eternity of the world, even God's attributes. Now let's zoom in on something a bit more, personal. His ideas about substance and accidents.
This is really where that act and potency framework gets applied to the very fabric of reality. So for Godfrey, substances are the things that exist in themselves. And then accidents, those exist in something else. They're modifications of substances.
Okay, so using a really basic example, a cat would be a substance, but its color, or how fluffy it is, those would be accidents.
Exactly. And Godfrey saw this whole substance-accident relationship as, you guessed it, another example of act and potency. The substance, like our cat, is the potency, the potential for accidents to exist. And the accidents, like its tabby stripes, are the actualization of that potential.
Okay, I think I'm with you so far, but this brings up a question.
Yeah.
So if a substance is the potential for accidents, does that mean it causes those accidents? Does the cat cause its own stripes?
That's where Godfrey gets super precise with his act and potency axiom. He would say no, absolutely not. Remember, nothing can be both in act and in potency in relation to the same thing at the same time.
Right. Because that would mean that something is both causing itself and being caused by itself, which doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. It's a paradox. So the substance can't be the efficient cause of its own accidents. Something else has to be involved, which brings us to some really complex discussions about causation and change, but
this is actually reminding me of something I read about Godfrey's view on how qualities change. Didn't he have some pretty radical theory about how something gets whiter, for instance?
You're talking about the succession theory, which has actually generated a lot of debate among Godfrey scholars. We don't actually have a complete text from him on this particular issue, so there's some discussion about whether he actually held this view. But the basic idea, as it's been attributed to him, is pretty wild.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
All right, so picture a piece of paper. Let's say it's off-white, and then it becomes brighter white. Now, according to this theory, it's not the same whiteness that's being intensified. Instead, the original whiteness is completely destroyed, and a brand new whiteness is created.
So it's not a gradual intensification, it's like a series of replacements. Constant creation and destruction of accidents as a quality changes.
Yeah, precisely. And it gets even more complicated when you start to think about how to apply it to things like the human soul and virtues. But the main point here is that Godfrey was really trying to come up with ways to explain change and intensification without contradicting his core principle that something can't be both in act and in potency toward the same thing at the same time.
It's pretty amazing how consistently he applied this framework to some philosophical problems.
Yeah.
So we've explored his ideas about substance, accidents, and even how qualities change. What about the human mind itself? Did he use his act and potency thing to explain how our minds work?
Oh, absolutely. This is where his ideas about act and potency, causation, and even free will all kind of come together. It's a really intricate and fascinating part of his thought.
Okay, lay it on me. I'm ready for the challenge. Let's dive into Godfrey's understanding of the human mind.
Okay, so for Godfrey, the human mind has two main faculties, intellect and will. The intellect, that's the power of understanding, of grasping concepts and ideas. And the will, well, that's the power of choosing, striving towards what the intellect sees as good.
So far, so good. Seems pretty straightforward, but I have a feeling Godfrey had a few twists on those classic concepts.
You know it. And surprise, surprise, this is where act and potency come back into play. Godfrey argued that the intellect is radically free. It's not determined by anything outside itself, not even sensory experience.
Hold on, wait. You're saying that our senses don't dictate what our intellect understands?
Really. That's what he said. He believed that there's this component of the intellect called the agent intellect that has this ability to abstract these universal concepts from the particular images we get from our senses.
So, we see a particular cat, but our intellect can grasp this concept of catness in general.
Exactly. And for Godfrey, that abstraction process is key to understanding how the intellect is free. It's not bound by the limitations of individual concrete things. It can grasp the essence of things, their whatness.
Okay, I see how that ties into his ideas about essence. But what about the will? Isn't that where free choice comes in?
This is where Godfrey's commitment to that act and potency axiom leads to some really interesting conclusions. He argued that the will can't actually be the direct cause of its own acts.
Wait a minute, why not? That seems to go against the whole idea of free will.
Remember that principle we talked about earlier? Nothing can be both in act and potency toward the same thing at the same time. So if the will was the cause of its own choosing, it would be both the mover and the moved, the actualizer and the potential, which Godfrey saw as a contradiction.
So if the will isn't causing its own choices, what is?
For Godfrey, it's the object that the intellect presents to the will. So the intellect understands something as good, and that understanding moves the will to desire it, to choose it.
That makes sense, but it also sounds a little bit deterministic, doesn't it? Like, if my intellect sees a big piece of chocolate cake as good, am I automatically going to choose it? Where's the free will in that?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something that philosophers have been debating forever. Godfrey would say that the freedom is in the intellect's ability to present different objects to the will and to consider those objects from different angles. It's not just a simple one-to-one relationship.
So my intellect could consider the cake's deliciousness, but also consider its potential impact on my health, let's say, and then my will would choose based on that more holistic deliberation.
Exactly. And the will itself isn't just passively taking orders from the intellect. It has this kind of what we might call executive power to direct the other mental faculties like attention and memory to focus on certain aspects of the object. This is where our own individual agency comes in.
So if I'm trying to resist that chocolate cake, I can tell my mind to focus on something else, like how much I enjoy feeling healthy and energized.
Exactly. The will, even though it's being moved by the intellect, plays an active role in shaping how we perceive and respond to the world. It's this really subtle and dynamic interplay between intellect, will, and the things we encounter.
Wow, this is making me completely rethink what it even means to have free will. It's not just about making these isolated choices. It's about this dynamic relationship between our intellect, our will, and the world around us.
And remember, Godfrey was developing all these ideas within the context of his Christian faith. He believed that God created us with this amazing freedom, but that it's up to us to use it wisely.
That's a powerful thought. Godfrey's reminding us that freedom isn't just this abstract philosophical idea. It's a responsibility. We have this incredible ability to understand and choose, but with that comes this obligation to use those abilities well. It's a pretty profound and challenging legacy he's left us with.
I agree. Godfrey of Fontaines was a truly remarkable thinker, and his work continues to challenge and inspire us today. He really pushed the boundaries of philosophical inquiry, grappling with these fundamental questions about being, existence, knowledge, and the nature of God. His legacy is a real testament to the enduring power of the human mind to explore even the deepest mysteries of reality.
Well, it's been an incredible journey through the mind of this 13th century philosophical giant. Godfrey Fontaines has given us a lot to ponder, and we're definitely feeling the act and potency of his ideas. Until next time, listeners, keep diving deep and keep those minds open to new possibilities.